or a school system. Obviously, it has to have financial support. It has to have teachers willing to teach for a pittance, unfortunately. We don't pay our teachers enough. But if those teachers didn't do their work, there'd be no schools. So you get the point. This also actually applies to a lot of personal change. Sometimes, for example, if we're working with an addictive disorder, if you put your alcohol abuse in that pyramid, uh, so many of us, we try to take that on head on, but the 12-step program clearly shows that doesn't work. So what you have to do is to start looking at what's keeping that in place. And you start taking away the supports. So a sense of isolation uh, keeps alcoholism in place. And so you start going to meetings. A notion that you can just defeat it on your own keeps it in place. So you start with the first step saying, acknowledging that you don't have that kind of power, that you do actually have power, but you don't have that kind of power. So I hope you're getting the point here, that whether it's personal change, uh, your immediate social environment, or large scale change, that this is a model that really, really emphasizes how we go about creating change. So I really want you to just take this in. If you got a piece of paper, copy it down, and use that when you go back to your activist groups or whatever community you're a part of, that in which you're trying to come up with some kind of an effective action, because this is going to be the core model that we return to over and over again when we start thinking about building a strategy for change. When we start looking at building strategy, one of the first things we want to do, and let me just say that one of my frustrations with activist groups is the first question anybody ever asks is, what do we do? We got to do something. And so if I have one message I want to send, it's like, don't start there. Start with your strategy questions, because you don't know what you're going to do until you really understand why you're going to do it. And if you leap too quickly to the doing question, you might very well come up with something that either is not very effective or doesn't make the best use of your resources, or even can be counterproductive. So if we look at that model, then it's pretty obvious in order for some of those pillars to wobble or even to be taken away, you're going to have a pretty solid grassroots movement. So the goal here is to increase the power base. You don't have to increase it across the board. You just have to have a kind of a critical mass. A couple of researchers, Harvard professor Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, wrote a fascinating book. In fact, I'll show it to you here. Did a lot of research and came up with this book, Why Civil Resistance Works. Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan. So if you're the kind of person who loves to dig into that kind of thing, I recommend that book, because they did a lot of research and they have a lot of wisdom about why nonviolent actions work when they work, why they fail when they fail, and how to maximize the effect of your strategic planning. One of the statistics that they came up with was that commonly a tipping point is somewhere around 3% or a little bit more of the population. When that percentage is engaged, things really begin to shift. And that number is not exactly right. You'd have to look it up in the book, but it's not a very high number. Although when you think about 3% of the population of a country the size of the United States, we're talking about an awful lot of people. Our goal here is to build toward that number, to begin to work toward building a grassroots movement that has enough participation that the effect is really felt and responded to. Okay, we're not quite there currently, but we're getting there, because all you have to do is see what's going on in the news these days, and you can see where the Trump administration is responding to social pressure. I'll guarantee you that Trump is a master at this model, at this pyramid model. He really gets it, and he understands how to get people behind what he wants to do. So he knows that when a certain critical mass is reached, he's toast. It's not going to work. He's going to have to shift gears. And you can see him starting to do that. For example, with some of these court challenges, he starts to backpedal on some of it. So when we're thinking about building actions around whichever piece of this you're wanting to focus on, whether it's these draconian deportation actions, whether it's this current tariff nonsense or any other aspect of what he's trying to do, um, this is the model you want to use. So it's important to pay attention to the polls. I'm not a big fan of polls, but they do give important information. So if you're working on something that the polls tell you Trump has 47% approval, you're probably swimming upstream a little bit. That's not to say don't do it. I'm just saying be aware that you probably want to focus your action in a way where you have a greater chance of success. You want to move that needle. You're not going to move people on the wings, okay? You're really focused on the fence sitters and those who are more centrist, simply because it takes a lot more effort to move somebody who's further out on the edge. Okay, so for example, polls, let's take immigration, for example. The polls show there's approximately 70% approval for deportation as long as people believe that those being deported are criminals. So you can see that part of Trump's strategy is to label everybody a criminal because that's where he gets his support. So we know they're not all criminals. In fact, we also know that probably the vast majority of them are perfectly wonderful citizens who are working hard and even contributing to Social Security, which they will never collect. Uh, and very important to our economy and to our social commerce here. So we want to, one possible action would be to really focus in on this idea of exposing the lie about deportees being criminals. Is going to appeal not only to your own base, those folks who share your point of view, but those that you really want to move who might be on the fence. You also really want to make sure that you are creating actions that don't actually create more polarization or alienate those who aren't necessarily going to agree with your position. So when you're out there in a rage about something, you might need to find a way to express that rage, but don't do it in public because that doesn't actually help move the needle. It tends to be polarizing. So I want everybody to think strategically and responsibly rather than reactively. We'll talk about that more next time. One of the things that power holders understand really well is just the point that you just made, Sheridan. And consequently, they will sometimes plant agents provocateurs, provocative agents, infiltrated into activist movements in order to incite violence or the kind of polarizing actions that we're talking about here, so that the regime will have justification for repression. So if you're not really connected to the importance of appealing to a broad grassroots movement, in non-polarizing ways, you're actually doing their work for them. You're contributing to something that the regime is quite happy that you're contributing to because you're providing them with justification for repression. Because one of the values that's going to be present across the board is the value of law and order, right? So that's the go-to value that repressive regimes often reach out for as a justification for repression, law and order, law and order. So as nonviolent activists, we want to be very respectful of the rule of law. We want to participate in law and order. And consequently, we're going to move right up to the edge of that in order to make the point. But don't let your civil disobedience cross over into the kind of law breaking that alienates the law and order crowd. So we'll talk about that too later on. Civil disobedience is the fundamental thing to understand about it is the selective disobedience of unjust laws. So in the Nashville sit-ins, for example, they were breaking the law, but the segregation laws were unjust laws. And so the civil disobedience of sitting in at a lunch counter is a perfect example of how nonviolent civil disobedience is supposed to work. But if you're blocking traffic on a busy morning when people are trying to get to work, and that's your idea of civil disobedience, it's gonna boomerang. People are going to be mad at you because you're getting in the way of them getting to work on time. So it's very important to be careful about the message you're sending with your action. You know, it's so tempting to think that you're sending a message to Trump or you're sending a message to Washington, you're sending a message to people who are on the other side of your issue. Uh, sure, that might be the way you're framing it, but really what you're doing is you're sending a message to the audience, to the observers, the bystanders. You've got an audience. And so think of yourself as on stage. You're actors on stage, and what you are enacting is going to appeal to those people who are bystanders, whether they're literally there or whether they're bystanders through the news media. So that would include people like police. You don't alienate the police. Ultimately, if this goes the direction that we all fear it's going toward devolving towards some sort of a dictatorship, we're going to need the police on our side. We're going to need the military on our side. We're going to need to be really, yeah, there you go. That's great. That's great street theater. That's clown theater right there. It's a great image. And if you look at that, yeah, it's kind of edgy. It's in a way they're kind of mocking the police, but not in a really confrontational way. I mean, it's kind of funny. I mean, look, there's something about street theater that puts observers in a more curious state rather than a reactive state. Uh,
Yeah, and
so
also, I mean, the clown gets to show up, make this image, and then slip away. And they have made a parody without words. Police, she's using her, her wired earbuds like cops do with the FBI. You guys on Zooms right now with this woman at the far right, Robin Hembrook. She's in the UK, but we're working on Activist Clown Academy.
yeah, that's great.
So, so we can have fun with our strategic nonviolence.
Absolutely. And I just saw in the chat somebody said something about images are harder to argue with. Yeah, that's absolutely right. We're not trying to mount a verbal argument based on conflicting points of view. What we're trying to do is create an image. And so people go home and they have to wrestle with that image. What does it mean? What's the point here? And so, actually, the mind really does respond to narrative and image more so than it does to rational argument. You try to make a point, it's kind of invites a counterpoint. But if you're just putting out an image, then the observer kind of has to look at it and go, huh, I wonder what that's about.
Those of us going to hands-off rallies tomorrow, how can we de-escalate tensions? And then the second half of my question was, any specific most highly recommended slogan or, thing to be saying, thing to be postering?
Well, one of the, on the de-escalation part of that, one of the things that activists have done, and I think it's a really important thing to do, is to have people who are basically acting as marshals. So they're not necessarily embedded in the activist protest, but they are circulating in the crowds of observers and just paying attention to who may be escalating from the other side. And to have people who are skillful in de-escalating tensions. And that might happen within your activist group if you've got people who are super angry and just want to shout. Those folks need to be de-escalated, but also people in the opposition. So I think having some people who really are skillful at de-escalating tension and having them agree to be marshals is always a good idea. As far as the slogan is concerned, I think, you can be really creative with those things. Just be clear that you're not saying something that is attacking somebody, or doing mocking or demeaning and that kind of thing. You can make your point. You can say deportees are not criminals. You can say tariffs equals inflation. The simpler the message, the better. And we don't buy what's on those signs, but we can create our own. Tariffs equal inflation. Straightforward, just right there. So those kinds of things I think are what's important in messaging. Simple is better than complex, and make sure it's not attacking or mocking. That's what I would say about those.
Yeah, and we have another couple of people too, and that is the opposite of what we're getting, right? And I mean, not criticizing people that are being activists now, but just in the core of my being, I don't want to attack the other side because I know that for every reaction there is a reaction, and I want it to stop. I want to find stability. I want to support the democracy.
Some of the historical examples and some of the uses of things like strikes and boycotts and so on. Obviously, that depends upon a fairly large group of participants, because just one person refusing to shop at Target or Walmart isn't going to make much of an impact. But a broad-based organized boycott or strike sends a powerful message. The Danes during the Nazi occupation did work slowdowns. They didn't stop work, but they just worked at a snail's pace, just slowed everything down. Sent a powerful message. It really is important to see how powerful people truly are when they are organized. So perhaps as this devolves, there may be more people out there organizing some kind of a general strike, and that will certainly send a powerful message. And this is really outside the box for a lot of people. I once did a consultation for an activist group, and I asked the group, "How many of you watch Fox News?" Well, just predictably, nobody raised their hand. Well, why not? You need to understand what is going through the brains of the people you want to influence. Why do people like Trump? What is it that keeps this number at somewhere in the mid 40s of approval? That seems, and that's beyond me to understand how anybody could support him. But there's obviously people who are persuaded by certain kinds of arguments and experiences. So, as distasteful as it might be, I highly recommend that you really try to get yourself inside the perception of the people you want to influence. It's important to understand why people think the way they do. For one thing, it will inform your strategy building, but for another, it will help you begin to find some compassion for people. And if you can't really relate to somebody who is on the opposite side of the fence from you, you're not going to really be able to come up with an action that appeals to them very well. It's too easy to see somebody as an enemy. It's much harder to try to really understand why somebody believes something that you find really distasteful.
One of the signs I was going to make based on information someone gave me was zero new tariffs on Russia, and then underneath that, why? Question mark. And since I didn't see this myself, was that true that when he was going over the tariffs, there was none on Russia? Does anyone know?
Well, yeah, that was in the news this morning, and I don't know if I think it's true. It was reported, I think, in the New York Times. I think even Stephen Colbert made some kind of comment about that. It's probably worth researching to make sure that that's accurate, but that is my understanding. These across the board tariffs, nevertheless exempted Russia.
Because with the signs, we're trying to, I mean, I understand what you say about pictorial and stuff, but aren't we trying to make people aware of things if they don't watch the news that they may not be aware of that affect them directly?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. No, it's not an either or. I mean, by all means, create your signs and make the point. I just want to add this perspective that even holding up a sign is a form of street theater. So it's more than just the message. It's who's holding the sign. What do they look like? What's their demeanor? Are they shouting or are they kind? So definitely put the message on the sign, but remember that there's more to communication than just words.
Have we talked about the huge potential of organizing former Trump 24 voters who are now angry and upset in the 3 or 4, actually about 6 or 7 vulnerable GOP districts? For example, Brian Fitzpatrick here in Bucks County in Philadelphia, and there's quite a few others around. And there's also 3 vulnerable senators besides the possibilities of getting Murkowski and Collins to vote our way. Have we talked about that strategy? Because I just posted, I hope, a well thought out strategy about how quite feasibly very, very natural born organizers among these angry former Trump voters could in turn organize, mobilize their fellow angry Trump voters to put sufficient pressure on these vulnerable Republicans to actually give us a majority on the critical votes, the most important votes about saving the Constitution, saving rule of law, that sort of thing. Have we talked about that already?
That's definitely a
Not,
strategy.
yeah, not specifically that, but it does fit into one of the larger points that we wanted to make this morning, and that is that our target audiences are really people on the fence. We're not gonna have much impact on hardcore MAGA Republicans, but people who are disaffected, who have buyer's remorse, people who voted for Trump but who are now shocked and appalled and feel betrayed, that's a really critical part of the population that we would like to bring in. However, remember, these folks really believed in Trump when they voted for him. And it's really hard for most people to admit they're wrong. A lot of people want to, double down and defend their choice because it's kind of embarrassing to say, wow, I got duped. So let's be tender with those folks. and understand that they're struggling because they feel betrayed. So with that in mind, by all means, reach out to disaffected Trump voters, anybody who's kind of in that central region of fence sitters or people who are ready to switch sides. But just make sure that the invitation is a gentle one. They're not going full on left wing liberal because that's not in the cards for them.
Do you have any advice on how to deal with or how to talk with young people who are leaders in organizing the protests in our town who feel that nonviolent protest includes destruction of private property?
Well, I think the strongest argument there is the strategic one. You can make a moral case against don't destroy property, and you can argue from a number of different perspectives. But when I've been in those kinds of conversations, what seems to have worked best is to say, let's take a step back and ask, how is this going to play to the audience? How does this work strategically? Not is it right or wrong, but if you're going to destroy property, the message that you're sending basically is that we're anarchists. We just kind of want to tear things down. And that's not what nonviolence is. Nonviolence is about replacing structures that are oppressive with structures that actually work. So Gandhi, especially later in his life, he started emphasizing what he called constructive program. Namely, we want to build up alternative institutions that actually do work. We're not anti-institutional and we're not anarchists. And destruction of property sends the wrong message. So strategically, it's a bad idea. If you get into a moral argument about it, then it's not going to go anywhere because people are going to come up with all kinds of reasons for why that's a good thing to do. But strategically, it almost never works.
Another thing, and we'll get to Christopher and Elizabeth next. Another thing that Dan taught me is you are never going to win a political argument by using logic and reason.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that another time. Okay, Christopher.
Well, just on that point, Sheridan, another resource, I don't have the book right in front of me to hold up, but a really extraordinarily influential book is by Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, and the title is Why Good People Can't Talk About Religion or Politics. It is a powerful book. Haidt is a social psychologist, and he really gets it that people are not speaking from a reasonable and rational point of view, even though they think they are. He says, we're not researchers who are studying the issues and then coming up with reasonable arguments. We're more like lawyers who are simply arguing for a stance that we've already established. And a lot of the reason for that, excuse me, shout out. I got some wonderful lawyer friends. Kathy Lamott's right there, so forgive me for that crack about lawyers. But anyway, the whole point here is to say that what we're after here is a kind of message that is not going to be polarizing. So that's really what we're after because we are appealing to people's sense of belonging to something. And if basically what you're saying is that you're in exile, you don't belong, then that's not going to work. People vote according to their tribe. You've got to have your constructive program, especially if of course, we're not quite there. We could get to that point, but if at some point you've pretty much concluded that the regime is corrupt and needs to collapse, you really have got to have a working democratic system that can step into the vacuum. Otherwise, you're going to end up with the same kind of repression coming from the other side. And unfortunately, we have some historical examples of that. One of the reasons that the Arab Spring movement ultimately devolved is because there was not an adequate constructive program. So as much energy as we put into resistance to the oppressive stuff, we also need to be putting energy into creating institutions that actually work for everybody. So we've got lots of examples. Montessori schools, for example. I mean, there's so many organizations and institutions that human beings have created that actually work really, really well. And so we want to really be focusing on that as well.
I wanted to show you guys Dan's book, which is Praying in the Dark, Spirituality, Nonviolence in the Emerging World. Um, I, I can't even tell you how many times I've read this book. It's a few years old, and it is helping me every day to better understand nonviolent peace, violent peace, some things that we'll get to later in the other session. So it's 10:59, and thank you, everybody. This is the first of 5. These are held every 2 weeks, and Dan has really structured these to help build our understanding of how power works. So yeah, it's pretty exciting. Like I said, I kind of cry a little bit every day. And then now I end these like this, crying out of gratitude for people showing up, wanting to think strategically, wanting to think for the long term. And like I said, I'm starting an activist clown academy next. Okay, hope to see you in 2 weeks, everybody.